Most people think they know what happened on D-Day. A long line of landing craft, a grey sea, a beach covered in obstacles, young men running through the surf under machine gun fire. That image is not wrong, but it's only a fragment. What really happened during the D-Day landings in Normandy was far messier, more uncertain, and more improvised than most films or simplified histories show. Because D-Day was not just one landing on one beach, it was a huge, risky bet made in bad weather, with incomplete information, against an enemy that was weaker than it wanted to be but stronger than many soldiers expected. It was a day where some plans worked perfectly, others fell apart immediately, and thousands of small decisions by frightened, cold, seasick people mattered as much as the big arrows on the maps. To understand what really happened, we have to rewind a little and start with something that doesn't look cinematic at all: the weather forecast. In early June 1944, the Allied invasion force was already gathered. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of ships, gliders, paratroopers, landing craft packed so tightly with men and equipment that there was barely space to move. They were waiting in ports and harbors across southern England, sitting on a knife edge of tension. You cannot keep an army like that ready to go forever. Mile erodes. Secrecy becomes fragile. Supplies get eaten. Machines need maintenance. The invasion needed a window, a specific combination of tide, moonlight, and daylight. You want relatively calm seas for the small landing craft. You want a low tide at the right time, so that engineers can see and clear obstacles on the beaches. You want enough pre-dawn darkness for surprise, and then light for the landing waves to see where they're going. That window was narrow, and in June 1944, the weather was not cooperating. On June 4th, the invasion was actually postponed. Storms in the English Channel, low clouds, rough seas. It was not just uncomfortable weather. If the landing craft were tossed around too much, many troops wouldn't even reach the beaches in any fit state to fight. Bombers and fighters wouldn't see their targets. Naval gunfire would be less accurate. So the Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight Eisenhower, made the call. Delay. Hundreds of thousands of men stayed cramped on ships and in camps, knowing something huge was coming, but not knowing exactly when. That's the first important truth about D-Day. It did not begin with heroism. It began with waiting, seasickness, and doubt. On the night of June 5th, meteorologists brought a fragile piece of good news. A brief, imperfect break in the weather. Still cloudy. Still rough. But just enough of a gap to make the invasion possible. If the Allies were willing to accept higher risk, Eisenhower had to decide. If he said no, the next suitable window might be weeks away. That meant moving and hiding this gigantic force longer than originally planned, with the real danger that German intelligence would detect patterns and figure out where the blow would fall. If he said yes, he was sending thousands of men into dangerous seas and uncertain skies, with no guarantee that the enemy's defenses were as weak as planners hoped. In a small room, after hearing his commanders, Eisenhower paused, then said the words that pushed history forward. "Well, go." Outside, across the ports and harbors of southern England, engines started. Ships moved out. Landing craft were loaded and lowered. Paratroopers and glider troops prepared to board aircraft. D-Day had begun. Not with a single dramatic moment on a beach, but with a quiet decision in bad weather and a lot of people getting very, very nervous. And this is the second big truth about D-Day that often gets lost. It was not just a beach landing. It was a system of operations happening at the same time. A massive naval armada crossing the channel. Bombers and fighters attacking roads, railways, and defenses. Paratroopers and glider infantry dropping behind enemy lines. Engineers and sailors dealing with obstacles, mines, and tides. 5 separate landing zones, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, each with its own terrain, defenses, and problems. When people say D-Day, they often imagine one story. In reality, 5 very different stories were happening on 5 different beaches, plus an entirely separate nightmare in the skies and fields inland. Some of those stories went surprisingly close to plan. Others looked, for several hours, like they might end in total disaster. As night fell on June 5th and slid into the early hours of June 6th, another quiet, crucial part of the operation began: the airborne landings. Before the first landing craft ever touched sand, thousands of paratroopers and glider troops were already scheduled to drop into Normandy. Their job was to seize key bridges and crossroads, block or slow German reinforcements, and create confusion behind the coastal defenses. They were the first wave of the invasion that most people never see in beach scenes. For many of them, D-Day began in the dark belly of an aircraft, sitting on benches along the fuselage, equipment rattling, wind whining outside. Planes flew low over the channel, then over the fields and hedgerows of Normandy. There were navigation errors, anti-aircraft fire, clouds and smoke. Many paratroopers were dropped far from their intended zones. Some landed in flooded fields and drowned under the weight of their gear. Others landed alone or in small groups, with no idea where their unit was. Chaos, again. But that chaos had a strange side effect. Small groups of Allied soldiers popped up in unexpected places all over the countryside, firing at convoys, cutting wires, attacking or simply spooking German units. To the defenders, it felt like more was happening than there actually was. The psychological impact was larger than the numbers. Meanwhile, far out at sea, the surface of the channel was moving with the shapes of ships. This was one of the largest armadas ever assembled. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, tugs, minesweepers, and, crucially, dozens and dozens of small landing craft that would actually carry men to shore. On the decks and inside those craft, thousands of soldiers were dealing with something quite unglamorous: seasickness, fear, and cramped space. Many had never been in such rough water before. Some had never even been on a ship. They tried to sleep sitting up. They tried not to think about what awaited them. They checked and rechecked their rifles, their packs, their ammunition. Some prayed. Some joked too loudly. Some stared at the floor, waiting for the ram to drop. They had seen briefings, maps, and sand models of the beaches. They had been told about obstacles, mines, and bunkers. But maps and models are clean. Reality would not be. By the time dawn started to lighten the horizon on June 6, the invasion force was in place. Naval guns were ready. Aircraft were already above the coast. Landing craft were lining up, and in the bunkers and strongpoints along the Normandy coast. German defenders were waking up into a very complicated situation. They knew an invasion was coming sometime, somewhere, but they had been led to believe that the main blow might fall elsewhere, on a different stretch of coast, thanks in part to Allied deception operations. Some units were under strength. Some officers were away. Some reinforcements were held back, waiting for clearer signs of where the main attack would be. D-Day did not hit an unprepared enemy, but it did hit a confused and imperfectly organized one. That confusion would save lives in some places and fail to save them in others. This is where most stories of D-Day finally zoom in on the beaches. But to really understand what happened there, you have to remember everything above. A rushed weather window, a massive, fragile armada at sea, scattered paratroopers inland sowing confusion, a mix of strongpoints and gaps in the German defense, and thousands of very human, very nervous men about to discover that some landing zones would be survivable, and others would feel like walking into a wall of fire. At first glance on a map, the 5 landing zones of D-Day look similar. 5 code names: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. 5 stretches of sand on the same coast, but on June 6, 1944, those beaches might as well have been 5 different planets. Same operation, same overall plan, completely different realities. Utah Beach were on the wrong beach, and that's good. Let's start with the one that almost feels like a quiet success story. Utah Beach. American forces landing at Utah were actually pushed off course by strong currents and navigation errors. When the first waves came ashore, they realized they were about a kilometer south of their intended landing zone. Normally, that would be a serious problem. The whole plan, where units go, which exits they use, which strongpoints they neutralize, depends on precise positioning, but sometimes war rewards mistakes. The sector where they actually landed was less heavily defended than the one they were supposed to hit. One American general, after being told they were in the wrong place, reportedly said something like, "Never mind, we'll start the war from here." The main German defenses were bypassed almost by accident. Naval gunfire and earlier air attacks had already weakened the area. So at Utah, despite scattered resistance and obstacles, the landing became a relatively low casualty success. Men still died. There were still mines and shells and confusion. But compared to what was happening elsewhere, Utah looked almost like a best-case version of D-Day. The key exits inland were secured. Troops moved off the beach and linked up, or tried to, with paratroopers, who had spent the nights fighting in the dark. From Utah, the invasion began to push inland. Gold, Juneau, sword-hard fights. But the plan survives. Now shift your mental camera to the central and eastern beaches. Gold, Juneau, and Sword. Here, British and Canadian forces were coming ashore. The defenses were real. There were strongpoints, artillery, machine gun nests, and obstacles. But crucially, the pre-invasion bombardments and naval gunfire had more effect here than they did at Omaha. At Gold Beach, British forces confronted stubborn resistance in some sectors, especially around fortified positions, but they also had powerful support from specialized engineering tanks, armored vehicles designed to clear obstacles, crush wire, launch small bridges, and help infantry move off the exposed sand. Bit by bit, strongpoints were isolated and reduced. Towns near the beach were fought over and taken. By the end of the day, the British at Gold had moved inland and were pressing on toward their deeper objectives. At Juneau Beach, Canadian forces had a harder initial time. The first waves took significant casualties, especially crossing through obstacles and mine shallows. For a painful stretch of time, it looked like Juneau might turn into another disaster. But the Canadians pushed through the killing zones, broke into the towns behind the beach, and began fighting their way street by street inland. Once past the initial line, their progress was surprisingly strong. By nightfall, Canadian troops from Juneau had advanced farther inland than almost any other Allied formation. D-Day. At Sword Beach, British troops landed on the eastern flank. Here too, resistance was serious but not decisive. One important mission near Sword was to link up with airborne troops who had landed during the night and captured key bridges and positions. Among those airborne missions was the famous capture of a vital bridge, later nicknamed Pegasus Bridge, by glider-borne troops. The idea was simple but critical. Hold the bridge, and you keep a door open for the Allies to expand their foothold. Lose it, and German counterattacks could slice into the landing zone. Through intense fighting, the bridge was held. In all three sectors, Gold, Juneau, Sword, the story is similar in shape. Rough landings, real casualties, some plans failing, others adapting, but overall, the assault working well enough to get troops off the beaches and into the Normandy countryside. Not clean, not easy, but successful, which makes what happened at the 5th Beach stand out even more. Because while Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword were fighting uphill but advancing, Omaha Beach was having a completely different kind of day. Omaha Beach. This might fail if you picture D-Day as a cinematic nightmare. You are probably picturing Omaha Beach. This was another American landing zone, wedged between steep bluffs with limited exits inland. The plan assumed that earlier bombardment from air and sea would significantly soften German defenses, but reality did not match the plan. Cloud cover and other factors had reduced the accuracy of the air bombardment. Many bombs fell too far inland, leaving beach defenses largely intact. Some German units in this sector were more experienced and better positioned than Allied planners had hoped. The beach itself offered terrible conditions: wide tides, exposed sand with little cover, shingle banks and sea walls, steep slopes and cliffs where defenders could look down and fire. When the first waves of landing craft approached Omaha, they sailed into concentrated machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire. Some craft were hit before the ramps even dropped. Others dropped their men into deeper water than expected. Heavily loaded with equipment, many soldiers drowned before firing a single shot. Those who made it to the sand often found themselves pinned down, pressed against low ridges or obstacles, unable to move forward. Commanders were killed or wounded. Radios were lost or destroyed in the surf. Units became jumbled together, companies mixing with other companies, leaders trying to piece together who was still alive and who wasn't. From the perspective of a soldier on the ground, Omaha did not look like a grand operation. It looked like chaos and death. For hours, it was unclear whether the landing there would succeed at all. Higher up the chain of command, reports were grim. Some voices began to consider whether Omaha might have to be abandoned. But on the sand itself, small groups of men began to do something that no plan can order. They started to crawl forward anyway. Engineers, under fire, went to work clearing gaps through obstacles and wire. Individual officers and sergeants, often taking over after senior leaders were killed, gathered whoever they could reach. 10 men here, 20 men there, and pushed toward the bluffs. In many cases, they avoided the most obvious routes and instead used small draws, ravines, and craters blown open by earlier shelling. Some climbed up steep slopes that defenders had not expected to be used as assault paths. Navy ships, seeing the disaster, took greater risks. Destroyers came in closer to shore than originally planned, sometimes so close that they risked running aground, to fire directly at German positions that were slaughtering men on the sand. Bit by bit, concrete strongpoints were smashed, machine gun nests were blinded, and the thin, scattered lines of attackers were able to get a toehold on the high ground. It was not the plan. It was not neat, but it was just barely enough. By the end of that terrible day at Omaha, the beachhead existed. It was fragile, it was costly, but it was there. Omaha did not break the invasion. It almost did. And that almost is one of the most important parts of understanding what really happened on D-Day. If you put all 5 beaches together, you do not get one clean story. You get one landing that drifted off course and accidentally helped itself, Utah. 3 hard but generally successful assaults, Gold, Juno, Sword. And one near disaster turned into a narrow, bloody success, Omaha. You also get scattered paratroopers fighting improvised battles in the dark, naval crews making decisions under fire, pilots navigating uncertain skies, and German commanders trying to figure out whether Normandy was the real invasion or just a distraction. D-Day was not a single moment of triumph. It was a day-long struggle made up of thousands of small, desperate actions. And its real achievement was not just getting onto the beaches, it was staying there and beginning the slow, grinding process of turning 5 fragile footholds into a solid front in France. When people think of D-Day, they often imagine that once the beaches were taken, the hardest part was over. Sand secured, flags raised, victory music. In reality, June 6th was only the beginning of a new kind of nightmare. The invasion had succeeded in its first goal. The Allies were on the continent, but they were not yet truly in France. They were clinging to a narrow strip of land, 5 separate footholds, still vulnerable, still shallow. Now came the second battle. Turn those footholds into a solid, connected front that could not be pushed back into the sea. In the days immediately after D-Day, the map of Normandy looked like a cluster of bruises along the coast. Each beachhead, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword, had expanded a little, but between them were gaps, areas still held or contested by German forces. The first task was to link these bruises together. That meant pushing inland, taking villages, crossroads, and ridgelines, so that troops from one sector could support and reinforce troops from another. It sounds simple on paper. On the ground, It was anything but. Normandy was not open, flat farmland. It was a maze of hedgerows, thick, ancient earth banks topped with dense bushes and trees, dividing fields into small, enclosed rooms of greenery. From there, this looked picturesque. From the ground, it was a defender's dream. Every field was a potential ambush. Every hedgerow was a ready-made firing line. Every advance meant crossing a small, exposed gap and then trying to climb over or through a wall of foliage and earth, while someone on the other side might be aiming directly at you. Tanks could not simply drive fast across this terrain. They got funneled into narrow lanes, stuck at hedgerows, or forced to expose themselves when cresting a bank. Infantry had to clear each field, one by one, never knowing what waited in the next square of green. The Allies had trained for beaches and open assaults. Now they had to improvise a new kind of slow, brutal, field-by-field warfare. The Germans, for their part, were no longer dealing with theoretical invasion plans. They were now facing the reality of Allied armies on French soil. Some German units were still disorganized from the surprise and chaos of D-Day. Others, especially armored divisions, were being rushed toward Normandy to try to contain and, if possible, destroy the beachheads. This created a strange contrast. At the tactical level, German soldiers often fought from strong defensive positions, making full use of the hedgerows, villages, and high ground. At the strategic level, the German command structure was strained and fragmented. Arguments over when and where to counterattack, delays in moving reserves, air superiority increasingly in Allied hands, making daytime movement dangerous. Yet even with these problems, the German forces in Normandy were still tough, experienced, and dangerous. They could not easily throw the Allies back into the sea, but they could make every kilometer costly for the Allied soldiers on the ground. This meant that the days after D-Day did not feel like consolidation of victory. They felt like grinding, exhausting, small-scale battles. Take this village, hold that crossroads, clear that farm, push the line 300 meters forward, then dig in and wait for the counterattack. Artillery thundered constantly. Fighter bombers screamed overhead, hunting German vehicles and supply columns. Tanks tried to force passages through the hedgerows. Infantry discovered that to survive, they had to adapt. Some units began welding metal teeth to the front of their tanks to cut through hedgerows like plows. Others experimented with new ways to coordinate infantry, armor, and artillery in this claustrophobic landscape. Normandy became a laboratory of improvisation. The Great Invasion had turned into a slow-motion grinding machine. In certain sectors, the fighting became especially intense and symbolic. One such area was around the city of Caen, in the eastern part of the landing zone. Part of the original plan had envisioned Caen falling quickly to the Allies. Instead, it became a focal point of prolonged, brutal combat. German armored divisions, including some of their better-equipped units, concentrated in this region. The Allies tried again and again to break through, only to be met with fierce resistance. Caen and its surroundings were hammered by bombs, shells, and repeated attacks. The city suffered heavily, so did the men fighting for it. To the outside world, Normandy was liberation. To those inside it, it was often rubble, smoke, and body-strewn fields. On the western side of the Allied front, near the American sectors, a similar pattern emerged. Slow, costly progress, villages changing hands, fields taken and retaken. But as June turned to July, the weight of numbers and logistics began to show. Allied forces could replace losses more easily than the Germans. They could keep bringing in fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements through the growing ports and artificial harbors they had set up on and near the beaches. They also had another advantage, the ability to use air power not just over Normandy, but over the wider region. German attempts to mass for large counterattacks often ran into a deadly problem. As soon as they concentrated enough troops and vehicles to make a big push, they became visible, and Allied aircraft were called in. Convoys were strafed, columns were bombed, bridges were attacked. The Germans could still fight fiercely at the point of contact, at a hedgerow, a town, a ridge, but it was getting harder and harder for them to assemble the kind of overwhelming punch they would have needed to crack the Allied beachhead. By late June and into July, the story of D-Day had transformed from will the landings succeed into a different question: when and where will the Allies finally break out of this slow, hedgerow hell? That breakout did not happen on June 6. It did not happen in a single day at all. It came later, after more bombardments, more attacks, more painful trial and error. But its foundations were laid in those first confusing, bloody, exhausting days after D-Day, when holding the beaches and inching inland was anything but guaranteed. So when we ask, what really happened during the D-Day landings in Normandy, the answer is incomplete if we only talk about the morning on the sand. What really happened was that an incredibly risky, imperfect, and human operation survived the first day, endured the first week, and turned from a narrow gamble into a firm bridgehead that no counterattack could erase. By mid-July 1944, Normandy had become less like an invasion scene and more like a giant, grinding wound. For the Allies, it was frustrating. They had expected hard fighting, but many hoped that once the beaches were taken, the front would move faster. Instead, every kilometer inland had to be bought with local attacks, artillery barrages, and bitter, up-close combat in villages and hedgerows. For the Germans, it was exhausting in a different way. They were fighting on what they considered crucial ground, defending occupied France, but they were doing it with stretched supply lines, limited fuel, growing shortages, and more pressure from the air. Yet, despite all this, German defenders in Normandy managed to do something that isn't always acknowledged in simple versions of the story. They delayed the Allies 4 weeks. They turned what the Allies hoped would be a relatively quick push into a slow campaign that wore down both sides. From the German perspective, D-Day had answered one question and opened another. The answered question was, where will the main Allied invasion come? Normandy made that clear. The new question was, can we contain it long enough for something to change in our favor? Maybe a successful counterattack elsewhere. Maybe political problems among the Allies. Maybe a defensive line that held better than expected. But time, which had once sometimes worked for Germany, was now mostly working against them. Their losses in men and equipment were hard to replace. Their fuel situation was worsening. And the Allies, even while fighting in Normandy, were still bombing German industry and transportation systems far to the east. Yet at the front line, German infantry, paratroopers, and armored units often fought with grim determination. They knew that losing in Normandy would open the road into France and eventually to Germany itself. So they clung to towns and ridges, counterattacked when they could, and turned the landscape into a patchwork of strongpoints. To Allied soldiers, it felt like every little village had to be conquered twice. The eventual breakout from Normandy did not happen by accident. It was prepared with concentrated firepower. The Allies began planning a series of operations designed not just to push the line a little, but to tear open a wider gap. In the American sector, one key operation was launched in late July. A massive offensive, following a heavy aerial bombardment. Bombers dropped huge amounts of explosives on a relatively narrow sector of the German front, trying to smash defensive positions and break the cohesion of the units holding them. The results were messy. Some bombs fell short, killing Allied troops by mistake. The battlefield became a choking chaos of smoke and craters, but the cumulative effect was brutal for the German side. Parts of their defensive line shattered. Unit cohesion collapsed in places. Allied forces, especially armored divisions, finally found a gap they could push through instead of another hedgerow wall. This was the beginning of the breakout. Once the Allied armor and mechanized units were able to operate in more open country, beyond the worst of the hedgerow maze, the character of the campaign shifted. The front line began to move faster. German units that had already been worn down now faced the danger of being outflanked or encircled. One dramatic moment of this phase was the attempt by the Allies to encircle large parts of the German forces in Normandy, in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. This was a vicious, chaotic battle. Retreating German columns tried to escape through narrowing routes under constant air attack. Artillery and fighter bombers hit roads, bridges, and vehicles. The damage was catastrophic. Though not every German unit was trapped, losses in men and equipment were enormous. After Falaise, the German army in the west was no longer the same force that had tried to hold Normandy in June. It was damaged, fractured, and forced into retreat. Normandy, which had started as a question, can the Allies get ashore and stay ashore, had now become something closer to an answer. They not only stayed, they broke the German defensive shield in France. From here, Allied forces rapidly advanced across much of France. Paris was liberated in August. Other cities and regions followed. But it is important to remember, all of this, the breakout, the liberation of Paris, the pushing of the front toward the German border, was possible because D-Day had done its job. The landings in Normandy were not the moment when Germany lost the war, but they were the moment when a large Allied army finally established a permanent foothold in Western Europe. From that foothold, the rest of the campaign in the West unfolded. No amount of later German counterattacks could make Normandy unhappen. So, what really happened during the D-Day landings in Normandy? Part of the answer is familiar. Brave soldiers under fire, beaches under bombardment, heroic acts of courage and sacrifice. Those elements are true. They deserve respect. But the deeper answer is more complex, and in some ways, more human. D-Day was a high-risk decision made in imperfect weather. A massive logistical feat that could easily have gone wrong. An operation where some plans worked and others collapsed. And a day filled with confusion, fear, improvisation, and luck. On some beaches, the landings went roughly as intended. On others, like Omaha, the plan fell apart and success came from small groups of people who refused to stop moving forward. Even when the situation looked hopeless, the invasion was supported by paratroopers and glider troops scattered in the dark who still found ways to disrupt and confuse. Sailors, pilots, and engineers doing dangerous and often invisible work. Deception operations beforehand that misled German planners about where and when the blow would fall. And countless unnamed decisions by junior officers and ordinary soldiers reacting in real time to see chaos. From the German side, D-Day was a shock and a confirmation. The long-feared invasion had come, and despite local bravery and some strong defensive positions, the system as a whole could not prevent the Allies from forcing their way ashore and staying there. One of the biggest myths about D-Day is the idea that it was the decisive, single-day victory that turned the war. In reality, it was the opening of a door that had been prepared 4 years through industrial build-up, planning, training, intelligence, and previous campaigns. Walking through that door was costly and terrifying, but once the Allies were on the other side, the war in Western Europe could finally move toward its endgame. D-Day did not win the war in a day, but without D-Day, the path to victory in Europe would have been far longer and darker. The final truth is perhaps the least cinematic and the most important. D-Day was not clean. It was not flawless. It was not inevitable. It was a human event built from fear, courage, error, adaptation, and endurance. When you strip away the slow-motion beach scenes and the heroic music, you see what it really was. Tired, seasick, scared people stepping off boats into cold water, under fire, with limited information, and somehow managing, through thousands of individual acts, to turn a narrow strip of sand into the beginning of the end for Nazi rule in Western Europe. That is what really happened during the D-Day landings in Normandy,